Lecture 17, Xuanzang and Chinese Buddhism.
Hello again. With this lecture, we're going to complete what's traditionally referred to as the three teachings of China: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. We've already discussed the origins of Buddhism and its later division into two major movements. There was the Theravada school, the school of the elders, and then Mahayana, the great vehicle. Mahayana itself developed into competing schools, including the Madhyamaka school, the school of the middle way of Nagarjuna in the 2nd century, and the Yogacara school. Remember, that's consciousness only, that Vasubandhu developed in the 4th century. And then there were lots of other schools. The story from India is already complicated when it gets to China, and there it gets even more confusing. There are dozens of schools and scriptures and major figures. In this lecture, I'll provide an overview of how Buddhism became widely accepted in China, with a few sketches of some key thinkers, and especially a monk named Xuanzang. But we'll start with the big picture. Buddhism was first introduced into China in the 1st century AD. In the beginning, though, it didn't attract a lot of attention. It was mostly a religion for foreign merchants who were living in China. It became very popular, however, after the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 AD. As we saw in the last lecture, that was a time when a lot of people were looking for new answers. In some ways, the success of Buddhism is surprising. There were many cultural obstacles. There were suspicions about its foreign origins, right? Confucius never talked about Buddhism. It's not mentioned in the Confucian classics. The fact that monks and nuns abandoned their political and family obligations, that they didn't pay taxes, that monks weren't conscripted into the army, they didn't give labor service, which was an important part of the taxation burden on peasants. Monks and nuns don't do ancestor worship, so there's a concern about filial piety, and some people said, well, perhaps by their self-sacrifice they can earn merit that they can then transfer to their parents. There were also problems with translations, and a lot of competing schools that just kept everyone guessing. But Buddhism does succeed in China, kind of amazingly. By the middle of the 6th century, it's reported that there were some 2 million Buddhists in China and 30,000 monasteries. Okay, so now another list about what went right for Buddhism. First, it came in a time of political turmoil. Do you remember the chaos and warfare after the fall of the Han Dynasty? So when Buddhist missionaries knocked on people's doors, just sort of imagine this analogy, and said, we have a message for you. Our message is the first noble truth, all life is suffering. Some Chinese people said, wow, that's what I've always thought about my life. So there's an openness to new ideas. Confucianism had been discredited with the fall of the Han Dynasty and its close association with the imperial rule. And now there came new rulers into China, oftentimes nomadic peoples who invaded China and then settled down there, and some of their kings were very interested in Buddhism, partly because these are non-Chinese rulers, and Buddhism was a non-Chinese religion, and it stressed sort of the universality of human beings. Some of those rulers also claimed to be bodhisattvas. Some Chinese people liked the ethical standards of Buddhism, as opposed to, say, the flaunting of conventional morality that we saw in the 6 sages of the bamboo grove. And then there were parallels with Taoism in terms of the kinds of questions they asked and the way they spoke about things. And there are new forms of philosophy and art that come from India. So for the first time in China, we see giant statues and cave temples. And there are new ideas of the afterlife, very specific ideas of heavens and hells. And there are miracles that are done by Buddhist monks and by missionaries. Let's talk a little bit more about the Taoist connections. There are always considerable difficulties when a religion or a philosophy crosses cultural barriers. And in China, the first bridges for Buddhism were laid by Taoists. So they were talking about cosmology, about being and non-being. They both had meditative practices and yoga. You can imagine Buddhist missionaries coming in and Taoists saying, well, we do it sort of like this, and then they talk back and forth. But you need a common language to do that, which means you need translations. And the first translations just grab the closest Taoist term they can think of. So, for example, for the word Dharma, which in Buddhism means the teachings of the Buddha, the word that they get from Chinese is Tao. For Nirvana, they translate that as Wu, which is non-action or effortless action. Even though non-action seems like a very different idea than the liberation from suffering that we call nirvana. For the Sanskrit term for enlightened ones, they translate that as Taoist immortals. For the Sanskrit term for morality, they're going to be more specific, and they just translate it as filial piety and obedience. So they're conversing, but only because Taoists and Buddhists are ignoring a lot of differences between them. Actually, some people wondered if Buddhism was just another form of Taoism. Do you remember that some had thought that when Lao Tzu left China and went to the West, he must have gone to India, where he became known as the Buddha, and now those ideas are coming back to them in a slightly different form. Actually, by the way, in another example, in the standard translation of the Chinese Bible, the opening of the Gospel of John, which you may remember is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." When the translators looked at that passage, they had to make a choice as to whether they would translate the word "word," okay, in Greek it's logos, with a Chinese word that meant word, or whether they would pick a Chinese word that was philosophically loaded in a similar way to the word logos is in Greek. And that's what they went with. So, as I said, the standard Chinese translation, John chapter 1 starts with, "In the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God." The influence goes both ways. Religious Taoism, when we talked about Neo-Taoism, is certainly influenced by Buddhist ideas and practices. And then both of those religions are going to compete for state support. The Buddhist conquest of China is a huge topic, with dozens of important figures ranging from monks and scholars to missionaries and merchants and kings. I'm going to focus, however, on one particular individual, a Chinese monk named Xuanzang. His dates are 600 to 664. So this is the time when all of China was once again unified under imperial rule. The Sui dynasty brings it all together in 581, and then that dynasty lasts for about 30 years is all. And then that's followed by the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907. So about 300 years, one of the great glorious times of Chinese culture and art and poetry. Xuanzang was raised in a Confucian family. His older brother was a monk, and he became interested in Buddhism, and eventually he became an initiate himself at the age of 13. He was a very bright boy. It's said that he gave lectures to some of the older monks at that time, but when the Sui dynasty fell, he fled south with his older brother. Later on, Xuanzang described his experiences to one of his disciples that would write a biography of Xuanzang. And this is what he says. At that time, so this is the fall of the Sui dynasty in the turmoil between Sui and Tang. Xuanzang says, "The magistrates were destroyed, and monks either perished or took to flight. The streets were filled with bleached bones and the burnt ruins of buildings. At this time, the books of Confucius and the sacred pages of Buddha were forgotten. Everyone was occupied with the arts of war." At the age of 20, Xuanzang became a full monk, and then he went with his brother to the capital of the newly founded Tang dynasty. He started to learn Sanskrit, which is the language of some of these scriptures that are coming in from India, but the multitude of texts and the variety of schools was still very confusing. He came across a partial translation of a text by Vasubandhu's brother Asanga on Yogacara Buddhism. Remember, the consciousness-only school. But there were some missing parts, and Xuanzang thought, if only I could get the whole text, then all of my questions and puzzles and doubts would be resolved. So he decided that he was going to leave China. In 629, so he's 29 years old, he leaves. He doesn't have official permission, and because of border problems at the time, it was illegal for people to leave, but he sneaks out. He makes his way across the Silk Road. He writes later an account of his travels where he talks about dangers on the road from the heat, the desert, from robbers. He finally arrives in India a year later, coming in from Afghanistan in the northwest. Okay. Nobody goes directly from China to India. They have to go around and then down through the northwest because the Himalaya mountains are there. When he gets to India, Xuanzang discovers that the problems were much bigger than just a few missing chapters for a text. He found that there was a huge tradition of Indian philosophy and lots of competing schools of Buddhism that the Chinese hadn't really heard so much about. During his years in India, he debated other Buddhists and Jain monks and Hindus. He talks about meeting Samkhya and Vaisheshika philosophers. He visited many of the holy sites associated with Buddhism. He spent 2 years studying at Nalanda University. You may remember that institution from Lecture 14. After 16 years abroad, during which time he traveled about 15,000 miles, Xuanzang returned to China with 657 texts, along with several dozen statues and relics. The emperor had heard that he was coming and wanted a personal interview with him. When he saw him, the emperor said, "So why did you leave without permission?" But he continued, "Since you're a monk, then I forgive you. Things are okay." Actually, the emperor did more than forgive him. The emperor sponsored a translation project. He set up Xuanzang in a special monastery. This is the Big Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an. If you visit Xi'an today, you can still see this place. And so Xuanzang was there along with 20 assistant translators. And together, they did very accurate translations of over 70 texts. Some of them are quite long. And that took them about 20 years. So these translations aren't just going to use Taoist terms that don't quite fit. They're going to very carefully explain the Sanskrit terms and sometimes invent some new terms to fit these Sanskrit concepts. Students came to study with Xuanzang at this monastery from all over China and even from as far away as Korea and Japan. This was perhaps the largest translation project in Chinese history. There were texts from the Madhyamaka school, texts about Indian logic and Buddhist metaphysics, even a Vaisheshika work, but especially they were interested in Yogacara texts. Now remember, Yogacara Buddhism of Vasubandhu is the newest, most advanced Buddhism at the time. Xuanzang did a translation and then an amalgam of 10 Sanskrit commentaries on Vasubandhu's 30 verses. Actually, incidentally, the emperor also asked Xuanzang to translate the Tao Te Ching from Chinese into Sanskrit, which he did, but apparently that didn't have a great effect in India. Remember, the Darshana Hotel is not all that interested in what's going on out in the Tao Hotel. Xuanzang wrote a travelogue called The Record of Western Lands, and one of his assistant translators wrote a biography of Xuanzang that as told by. Xuanzang would tell stories about this, and then later, after he was dead, his disciple wrote this biography of him, based on his personal recollections. He tells the story of going to Bodh Gaya, which was the site of the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And this is how this biography explains that event. With the most sincere devotion, Xuanzang cast himself down with his face to the ground, and with much grief and tears he sighed and said, "At the time when Buddha perfected himself in wisdom, I know not in what condition I was, in the troublous whirl of birth and death. But now, in this lesser age, having come to this spot and reflecting on the depth and weight of the body of my evil deeds, I'm grieved at heart and my eyes filled with tears." Right? This is always the problem with pilgrimages, is you end up at the right site, but you are several hundred years too late to see the event that had caught your attention in the first place. Now Xuanzang knows that at the time the Buddha was enlightened, he was somewhere, maybe not in this world, or maybe as an animal or something, but whatever it was, his sins were such that he wasn't allowed to be right there where the action was really happening. On his deathbed, Xuanzang recited the Heart Sutra, which is a one-page synopsis of a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. And it has those famous lines, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." His translation of the Heart Sutra is still recited throughout East Asia to this day. So Xuanzang is a great mind. He's a traveler, a translator, a philosopher, and a monk. But Yogacara in Buddhism, the Yogacara school wasn't all that appealing in China. They were interested in some different sorts of Buddhism. There are 4 major schools of Buddhism that become prominent in China: Tiantai, Huayan, that means flower garland, Pure Land, and Chan, or meditation school, or Zen. None of those 4 schools was particularly important in India. I'll describe each of them and try to keep them in mind, because we'll see them again in Lecture 19 when we talk about Japanese Buddhism. 2 of the schools focus on doctrine, that's the Tiantai and Huayan, and then 2 of the schools on practice, and that's Pure Land and Zen. But all of them arise from the same problem. The Chinese didn't know much about the Indian background of Buddhism and its various schools. They just had translations of scriptures, and some of those scriptures contradicted each other, even though each claimed to have come from the Buddha himself. Remember, the definition of a Buddhist sutra is a record of something the Buddha had said. They generally start with the words, "Thus have I heard," and it's thought that Ananda had memorized everything that the Buddha had said. Okay, how are you going to resolve these contradictions? And there's already a model at hand, and it's the Mahayana explanation of Theravada, right? So Theravada Buddhism was the original Buddhism that the Buddha taught to regular people, but there were these higher teachings, secret teachings, that he reserved for his more advanced disciples. Okay, the Chinese have an ideal of harmony through syncretism, of bringing things together. Think about Dongzhongshu and the 100 schools of philosophy and how that comes into what Dongzhongshu does in Han Dynasty Confucianism, bringing together yin-yang and the 5 phases and the teachings of Confucius. So the Chinese idea is the Buddha must have said different things to different audiences depending on their capacity to understand. This is a concept called skillful means, that he'll use whatever it takes to try to get people to the next level of spiritual progress. But of course, they were curious, what's the last word? I mean, what's the Buddha's final truth? Okay, now we go to these 4 schools. The first is Tiantai, named for the Tiantai mountain, near the hometown of its founder. And in Japanese, this school is called Tendai. These Tendai Buddhists say that there are different levels of sutras, and the Lotus Sutra is the highest. The Lotus Sutra is going to be the most important Buddhist scripture in East Asia. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Japanese Buddhism. According to Tiantai Buddhists, there are 3 truths: that all things are empty, right? They're products of causation with dependent origination. They have no independent nature. Number 2, they do, however, have temporary existence. And then the 3rd level of truth is there's a perspective that transcends both of these, sort of a middle way. Buddhists love anything about the middle way. Tendai Buddhists say that all minds are the manifestation of one mind, of absolute reality. And that's the Buddha nature that's in all people and in all things. There are 3,000 realms of existence, and they're all interconnected so that each is present in each. All reality, they say, is immanent in a single instance of thought. If we go to the Huayan school, this is named for the Huayan Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra. It's similar to Tiantai, but it takes those ideas to another level, actually to the 5th level. So the first level is Theravada, right, that people are products of causation, that there's no self. And then the 2nd level is Mahayana, that everything is emptiness. And then the 3rd level is the higher Mahayana, that emptiness is not inconsistent with the illusion of phenomena. It's like Madhyamaka. And then 4th is the level that's beyond words. And then the 5th and highest is going to be the Flower Garland Sutra, which brings everything together in one absolute reality in which everything has the nature of non-being. Okay? The Huayan Sutra, they said, was actually the first sutra that the Buddha gave, right after he became enlightened. But no one understood what he was talking about. So then he started talking about the 4 Noble Truths and all of the things that Theravada Buddhists have preserved. According to Huayan Buddhists, every part of the universe reflects and incorporates every other part through interpenetration and through mutual identity of all things. Okay, it's sort of a form of monism. And if you think that's hard to understand, it was hard for the Empress Wu to understand as well. Empress Wu is the only woman in Chinese history who actually rules as an emperor. Okay, now there were other women who were dowager empresses or who ruled as regents, but Empress Wu in the Tang Dynasty just puts all that aside and says, no, I'm the emperor. There's a monk named Xuanzang who lives from 643 to 712. He's a prolific author, a great mind in Chinese thought, and he tries to teach this Huayan Buddhism to Empress Wu, and he does so with a couple object lessons. There was a golden lion at court, and he gave a famous sermon on the golden lion. He said the parts of that lion, the hair and the claws and the eyes and so forth,